90% of a child's brain develops by age 5. Data shows that the most important days in determining a child's quality of life, longevity, success throughout their entire life is the first 1,000 days. But in the US, where we spend more per person on healthcare than any other country, our present systems are failing far too many children and families. Those who give birth in the United States are 10 times more likely to die of childbirth related complications than people in other advanced and developed nations. Infant mortality is also high. The US ranks 33rd out of the 38 OECD nations in terms of infant mortality. And these tragic scores that are incredibly important in judging the health of a system itself and the way that our society treats each other. They only grow more stark when we examine the racial inequities baked within them. Black women are disproportionately more likely to die from childbirth related complications. The infant mortality rate, too, for Black babies is nearly double that of others. But what the data also shows is this isn't a fate that we must accept or a burden that we should leave to individual parents and families to shoulder. Starting from day one of a child's life, we can change our systems to create better outcomes. And thankfully, we know it works. For example, a landmark 20-year study released back in 2014 showed that children from a disadvantaged household who receives high quality stimulation at a young age, they grow into adults who earn an average of 25% more than those who don't. Countless studies have shown the importance of early interventions in care, safety, financial security, and education, and that they're both effective and achievable. Many of these factors are included in our Loving Cities Index, which SHOT produces and examines 25 key indicators across all sectors of a city that impact the well-being of children and families. And we can't wait. Every year we delay in implementing meaningful, equitable changes is a year that millions of children across the country don't get to do over. Every day counts. Every delay has a real cost in human life and potential. But thankfully, we don't need to wait for a sweeping bill from Washington, D.C. to start. We can start today. And our panelists today will share with you the urgency of the moment, the solutions that are at our fingertips already, and then how we can make change in our states, counties, and communities right now. And I'm thrilled to have a wonderful panel of speakers to walk us through these questions. Laura Burt, Senior Program Specialist at the National League of Cities, Krista Scott, the Senior Program Officer of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Zakiya Shakir Ansari, who's Co-Executive Director of the Alliance for Quality Education of New York, and Anthony Trotman, the Executive Director of the Katie Blessing Foundation. And for this conversation, I'd like to break this into three main topics. First, why this is a systemic issue and what's at stake. Then, the policies and solutions that can move the needle to impact those outcomes. And then the third and potentially most important, how we actually get there. If we know what the problems are, we know what the solutions are, what are the remaining barriers to get this to implementation? So I think for starters, I'd love to bring into the spotlight Anthony, Krista, and Zakiya to tackle this first topic. So first off, in the years before kindergarten, many families are expected to manage their child's mental and physical well-being on their own. Let me start with you, Anthony. What do you see as the systemic barriers to a healthy early childhood, and why do we need systemic approaches to understand and resolve them?
Well, first, Patrick, thank you for the invitation to participate on this panel. It definitely means a lot. As you introduced me, I'm Anthony Trotman, the Executive Director of the Katie Blessing Foundation here in Charlotte, North Carolina, where we're building the largest pediatric behavioral health hospital in the state of North Carolina. And prior to that, I spent the last 25 years in leadership at both the state and county levels in health and human services leadership. And one of the things that my experience tells me over this past 25, 26 years is that one, government is set up first to be accountable to taxpayers, and second, set up to be efficient. And as we build these systems, or we build programs, not so much systems, the programs are accountable by funding streams. And so families are forced to navigate each program based off of what, their needs are. But many times when families are in distress, especially families that have young kids, they don't need just one program, they need multiple programs, but they have to apply to each program, i.e., Medicaid, SNAP, child care subsidy, and any other program they need to support their family and their child. And it makes it very difficult to navigate. And thus, sometimes they don't get the support and help they need. And in many communities and many states, they have to go to many different locations to gain access to these various programs that they need, which is why, a big solution to this problem is to develop a systems approach and not a programmatic approach to deal with the problem.
That makes sense. And I think, Krista, given your work, that seems to dovetail pretty nicely with what you've been working through and seeing, in the programs that you're helping develop and the grants that you're making. I'd love for you to chime in to see how that fits and what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And thank you, Anthony, for teeing up that the problem so clearly. I want to start with this towel that a grantee organization, the Alliance for Early Success, gave to me. It says, I keep hearing it takes a village to raise a child. Do they just show up or is there a number to call? And I think that probably rings true for a lot of us. And first of all, I want to say I work at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We are a large national philanthropy that paves the way together to a future where health is no longer a privilege, but a right. We're committed to addressing structural racism and other barriers of health to achieve that vision. And I work on the Healthy Children and Family Strategic Portfolio. My job is to focus on one of our three generational goals, which is an inclusive economy that supports the health and well-being of children and families. And we want to make sure that the goals of our tax and economic systems, right, in those government systems, the purpose of that revenue is to support the health, care, and well-being of children and families. And my aperture here, even though I actually used to work in state and city government, as well as nonprofits, as a national funder, we don't have a specific state strategy. It's a little bit different here. But I think of my role as to create conditions in the national landscape and then within states for that state and local systems change. And so my priority systems are the tax and care systems. But I think, going back to that village, right? That village it takes. And to that point that Anthony made, which is that all of these programs, and frankly, our economic system requires people to go it alone. I think one of the big challenges, combined with the fact that we're focused on programs and not systems, is one, the level of the cultural mindset of individualism as opposed to shared responsibility and shared accountability to each other in those systems and in ourselves, that frames how we think about children, families, and society, that puts that where it's like the default to put all of that back on the children or their parents. And two, the fact that the goals of many of those systems, our housing, our health, our family care, our food systems, our transportation systems, they're not fundamentally anchored in that shared goal of the health and well-being for children and families. And so we can see how that we saw how that individualism plays out in those programs to the detriment of children and families. Anthony laid that out really clearly. And it's hard to tease them apart. But culturally, I want to just really emphasize in my lifetime, and I'm middle-aged, I'm not that old, but I'm also not that young anymore. I can see the huge shift away from the idea that we deserve better or more from our systems and our government. Um, the media reinforces it that we're in it alone. And so there's the expectation. What do our neighbors owe us? What does our community owe us? What should we even expect from our systems? That's really heavy on us, I think, as a country right now. And I think systemic approaches are critical for that reason. There's such deep cynicism right now and fatalism that we can expect and get better in this moment. And I think that philanthropy and policymakers expect one solution to fix all of that when it's many. Systems approaches are not easy. They recognize that they're interconnected. Um, and I'm also hopeful though, because systems are made up of people. And right now I'm looking at Minnesota and the way people are showing up for each other, neighbors are coming to show up for each other to protect each other, in spite of the fact that we're incentivized day after day to go it alone and be isolated. And they're doing it around the belief that all children and families are important. And so I think if we redirect that systems and and people together can change with each other, I think there's a deep opportunity to reclaim what it means to value children and families, not just in word, but in deed in this country. And so we can make child and health and well-being paramount in this country. Thanks.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I appreciate the mention of what's happening in Minneapolis. I think that is that people are coming together that are organized, and they're demanding together in a united voice for some real significant change, and a demand that these systems that our tax dollars fund, that we subject ourselves and each other to every single day, are actually treating us well with the respect they deserve. And I think to your point, Chris, that the culture of rugged individualism, which has been, sticky in the United States for so long, and in pretty great and inspiring moments, can be overcome, right, and can be complemented with questions of the communal, of the community oriented. I think that rugged individualism also, it makes us less likely to demand more of the systems around us. If we assume it's us versus the world, I think that can even limit our imagination of what's possible. I was just reading about how, I guess, since the 1930s, uh, every expectant mother in Finland receives what's called a baby box. And it's a little cardboard box, designed to give every child in the country, no matter what their background is, a bit of an equal start. It contains, bodysuits, snowsuits, given that it's Finland, a sleeping bag, outdoor gear, bathing products, first aid, as well as, little nappies, things like that, and then a little small mattress. And it becomes this sort of cultural touchstone in Finland that, the first time a baby sleeps on his or her own is in one of those little baby boxes. It becomes this thing that not only do we have together to have in our early experiences, but it gives us a sense that we're in this together because everybody's going through this, and everybody can have that sort of baseline of expectation from ourselves and each other. Um, and I think I want to bring in Zakia now, because as a longtime parent advocate, who has fought against the idea that these are individualized problems that we all need to deal with on our own, who has championed and won huge systemic change, with her colleagues and comrades in New York City. I'd love to bring you in to hear your thoughts on this so far.
Yeah, listen, y'all. I'm telling you, my camera was not working. I literally hit the camera. I said, I'm gonna give it one more chance. And this thing lit up. That's why you saw my face like I was shocked. But so I'm glad it's working. Hi, everyone. Yes, and I think part of the pre-kindergarten conversation is like a, a collective belief. I think that everything everybody has said, and a true investment in high quality universal childcare that is free. And I was in a meeting the other day and I heard someone say something very disturbing that says, all parents want is free. And I was just like, it was a clutch your pearls moment for me. I'm like, okay, you're advocating for childcare and you think that free childcare is a problem, but that's part of the problem, right? That people uh, think free means a handout. Like people are not deserving of free things. So to your point of how you talked about Finland, it was an investment. It was a long-term investment. It showed that we cared about your children from the very beginning. As soon as they come out of the womb, it allowed those families to actually things they didn't have to come out of pocket to pay. So it has all these different kind of benefits, including like, hell yeah, why not? Like the families just like, what are we doing here? It's not rocket science. And that wealthy folks and folks who can do things, do those things. I think part of it too is that childcare is not just babysitting, but it is portrayed that way because the people who need it the most are Black, brown immigrant folks. And so it gets portrayed as childcare so people can say, I'm not paying for somebody else's childcare. When, once again, the wealthy can afford to do that. It just is. My child will either have a nanny, and there's no shade on it, right? Like it's okay because you can afford it, but because you understand. First of all, I'm a mom. I'm a new mom. I need mental health. I need peace. If you've raised kids, you're a parent, a grandma, whatever, you know how children drive you crazy. That's just what they do. That's part of their nature. They're supposed to do that. But many times, many of our folks don't have a moment to like breathe. And that's if you have one. And let me say, I raised 8 children. So I have 8 kids. They're all grown now. But I can think about times when I had to put my children in a neighbor's care, which wasn't really education, but I didn't have a choice. But if I had free childcare, it would could have changed things tremendously for me. And so I think part of that. If the thing is that there's an investment, not everybody comes from the perspective of like just caring like a Finland, like about how we care for our children. That mental health is not at the forefront. It becomes dollars, which is part of the problem as well. It's an 8-to-1 investment. Hello? You talking about dollars? We can make hand over fist money right here. Have a happy populace where people are feeling happy and excited when their kids come home. Their kids are learning. Like we are shifting the K to 12 system because children are not Black and brown kids and poor kids are not coming in with less words. Learn. Those teachers are happier because those kids are ready to like jump in and all the things. It is a true investment in every area that we can think of if we do that. And also, I think part of it is like the workforce, which is something we're experiencing here in New York. And I'm sure it's all over the country. The investment in the workforce, which again is predominantly women, women of color, and immigrant women. There's a pattern here you might notice of what we're willing to investment and what we willing to investment and how hard we have to fight for the things and who would get the benefit of it, right? Which is really everybody. But because again, the folks who are receiving it, whether it's the children that are Black and brown or immigrant, or the care providers, the early educators who are Black, brown, and immigrant, it's always a struggle. And you opened up this way too, Patrick, around, infant mortality, Black maternal mortality, like all those things. It is a pattern we are seeing. We're not making it up. It is there in front of us for us to actually address and to acknowledge it. And then lastly, I'll just say, um, often what we hear too is like, it just costs too much. Well, I would challenge that it has cost too much not to do it. From how you talked about infant mortality and how we have not addressed that. Like we keep seeing the numbers and we're like, oh, that's a shame. Like, what can we do? And we see videos and we of Black women literally in front of us being denied their just like human right to, no one's listening to them, right? To the advocacy work that we do and others on this call are doing to like change that thing. But it costs too much to not do this on so many levels. And then I'll end and say, but racism plays a major role in all of this, right? You know, all those things play a major role in the reason we're not moving forward to actually finally address all the things systemically.
Yeah, I think that there are a few things I want to lift up from that, Zakia. First up, I think we've all been in conversations where we've heard oh, people just want free stuff argument, which is the silliest thing in the world, right? It's not, we don't think it's free, right? We just, the person who's complaining that way just doesn't like who would actually pay for it, right? And, if the history of this country has shown anything, it's if the people with the broadest shoulders carry the biggest burden, we can all have nice things, right? All our children can have meaningful supports. If people can pay what they can proportionally, progressively, that's the solution. It's the individualized market-based response to, well, if it costs on average, X dollars per person to do, that's on every single person. And when we live in a system with income and wealth disparity like we have, it's a recipe for inequity. All these other inequities seep into the system even deeper. And like you said, with childcare, childhood health has so much more factors involved than simply access to nurses and doctors and hospitals, however important those are. So I'd love to tee it back to you, Anthony, to talk about beyond access to health professionals. In your work, what are the other social determinants of early childhood health that you've seen and that you've been trying to tackle with through your career? And what are the ways in which you've seen pre-existing racial inequities sort of work their way into those outcomes if we don't actually tackle them right?
Well, I think all of the social determinants contribute to the issue of, that you described, infant mortality being one, but lack of access being another, having physical plants in the zip codes that need the access the most. But housing insecurity, food insecurity, lack of transportation, and lack of available employment, for the various populations that are in these communities are, some of the biggest contributors to the level of stress that the parents have, and that they then pass on to their children. And if there's not access to behavioral health treatment, or at least a recognition that it is needed, those issues will continue to happen. And another issue is that some of these systems label children to have a particular issue or diagnosis versus fixing the conditions that created the issue in the child. And those conditions are particularly in some of these underserved communities that, create these racial inequities. And so we have to look at things from a systems approach more so than a programmatic approach. Part of the issue, though, as I talked about early on, is that dollars are allocated to programs. It's rare that dollars from a government standpoint are allocated to systems. I'm happy that, my co-panelist Chris is here from Robert Wood Johnson, because I know they think about systems and systems approaches and fund different efforts that support systems. But many government entities, they don't do that, or the funding doesn't last long enough to even think about that. And so because the funding doesn't last long enough, you don't see the outcomes, and then you blame those programs or nonprofits for not meeting the expected outcomes to change the condition. And so we just go into these cycles until something else comes up. And so we really need to take a step back and shift our funding strategies from programs to systems, and really deploy programs and or from a systems approach in the neighborhoods that need it the most.
That's great. Thank you, Anthony. Chris, I'd love to tag you to follow up on that. And what is RWJF's systems change approach, if you want to, in brief?
Sure. Well, what I can't, we're 300 strong with 4 different strategic portfolios addressing 3 generational goals. So for me to dig in and really tell you about all of that would be a lot. But I can give you examples of how we're thinking about unhealthy children and families. As I said, the generational goal, we want there's transformed health and healthcare systems. There is healthy communities for everyone, and then economic inclusion for family well-being are the 3 foundational generational goals. The contributions I work to make are figuring out ways to build and bridge power within tax and care system actors. And so we're thinking about care. And as I like to say, there's the health and healthcare systems approach, which is primarily focused on healthcare access, which would include birthing people and the children. And I like to think once we catch the babies when they come out, then we're talking about the care for those children. So we're primarily focused on childcare, but increasingly we're trying to ask the question, what does a full system of care look like? Thinking about childcare not just as a place for education, but education, love, and support for child development that is also considering multi-generational factors. So we have investments in childcare, and we have investments in power building organizations who are multi-issue, because they understand that the childcare conversation isn't separate from those other conversations. So we think about it from the approach of how do we support sectors of power building and organizing? How are they working in concert with people who currently have power in our systems, right? Those advocates, policymakers, et cetera. Who are we investing in? And are they aligned about that shared goal where the purpose is health and well-being, right? Not just ROI. ROI is important, But if we think about the global economy, what matters more to children and families in this country in the pocketbooks of caregivers is an economy that they're in. So, how are we having that conversation about shifting their economies? And that includes paying providers of all kinds in our systems well, giving them a sense of dignity, worth, and respect, and the pay they deserve. All of those are factors that go into systems change for us beyond just a policy solution in 2 to 3 years. And we think about the relationships and skills it takes, the kinds of leadership it takes to do that work. Being a policy wonk is a great thing. I have that zone in my head. Being a policy wonk who's working to build power and in collaboration with other people at the table to take that hit to the ego when your idea isn't the best one is a different thing. And I don't think there's a lot of attention focused on that when we deploy dollars out the door. And so that's something that I'm proud that my portfolio thinks about when we're making investments in organizations and the things we look for in our grant agreements and scopes of work that people are doing. I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate that. And I think the point you made about the importance of supporting child care providers is so crucial. One of the classic lines we learn every time questions of educator, pay and compensation come up is our working conditions are your kids' learning conditions, right? And that applies to child care providers too, who are often, worse paid. They're often much more diverse in the population, and without solutions that involve them from the ground up, none of this is going to work. And speaking of from the ground up and these how we can change things in these communities, I'd love to bring in Melanie and Lara now to talk about what is happening and what can happen at the county and local level to actually move the needle now. And I'd love to bring in Lara to start. Um, Given especially what we're seeing as frankly a hostile terrain at the federal level, and depending on what your state it is in, some state level, are there ways that towns, cities, counties can step up and improve outcomes for young children and families? That NLC has such a storied history of working with cities on these really thorny, tricky topics. So I'd love to get a sense from you what the potential is and what you've seen.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. And just for those of you who aren't familiar, I'll just give a quick overview of NLC and our team's work. So we are a membership or based organization. We just celebrated our 100-year anniversary, representing nearly 3,000 cities, towns, and villages. And our formal spiel is that we aim to strengthen local leadership through resources, advocacy, and expert support. And so I am on the early childhood success team. At NLC, we work with over 90 municipalities and focus on building equitable systems by placing young children and families at the center of local policies, practices, and programs. And then within that, I primarily focus on our prenatal to 3 work. So getting to the question, Patrick, obviously the current political landscape is undeniably creating strain for cities and the programs and resources that children and families access right now. We are constantly hearing it from city leaders that we connect with. And I think we can't fully reverse federal or state level impacts, and some actions won't produce immediate results, but definitely think and see that cities are taking and can take meaningful steps to stabilize and strengthen the systems that everyone has been mentioning previously that will both benefit families in the short and long term. And so a few things that we're seeing cities do and crucial steps that we think are should be top of mind for local leaders during this time are assessing local impact. So really talking to the providers and the families and understanding which programs and families are being impacted and what alternative supports might be available, because sometimes it is just not making, Anthony, you talked a lot about silos and just not really understanding the supports and what's accessible. And so sometimes it might just be as simple as making those connections. Using the bully pulpit as a local leader, so elevating the importance of early childhood, explaining the real consequences of funding gaps, and making this work central to the city's economic development strategy. This kind of goes along with assessing local impact, but leveraging data to understand community needs, identify gaps, and advocating for policy or practice changes. So then when funding might come along, you know exactly where those dollars should go. And then there are many, many more thoughts and ideas, but the last one I'll stick on for a moment is coordinating across departments. Again, I feel like this conversation's had a theme of not working in silos and or the importance of that. And so what we see is really successful is when departments work and align with one another goals and services across agencies and departments at the city level. And oftentimes we see in cities, not just right now, but just in general, that early childhood might not have dedicated or a strong funding stream or dedicated office, or there's many competing priorities for local leaders. And so early childhood and prenatal to three and families aren't always top of mind. And so really the importance of like bringing together department heads to prioritize that population and making the connections, being like housing, office of sustainability, public works, like all of those offices really should keep those populations in top of mind. And so just one or two quick examples from cities that we're seeing, and one, the city of Boston, which I know gets lifted up all the time as like a model city for early childhood, and they have created such a strong system there. But something unique I think they're doing around extreme heat in early childhood kind of demonstrates this coordinating across departments. And so a couple of years ago, with the support of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, they brought together parents, providers, local pediatricians, and then as well as city staff members across the Office of Sustainability, Office of Early Childhood, and a couple offices that I'm not remembering at this moment. But they worked together to really understand the science of how extreme heat impacts that population, reached out to childcare providers across the city to see what protocols and systems were in place on extreme heat days. Created from this working group a citywide alert system that specifically targets that population. So not just it's a certain level of heat, make sure you stay inside, but like what to do if you have a child of that age or if you are a pregnant person. And then also, I think their city already had cooling centers, but really outfitted and made sure that they were located in areas in the city that were accessible to families and that they were comfortable for parents, breastfeeding parents to feed their babies, and there were games and everything, so families felt comfortable in wanting to stay in there. They've since formalized a children's council at the City of Boston, which brings together team members on a quarterly basis to kind of continue this work as well as other cross-departmental projects. So I think that's like just a wonderful example of, you don't always think about extreme heat and maybe making those connections, but it has had such a big impact on the city's population. And so definitely think during this time and always like reaching across departments and trying to make a difference in that way. I'll pause there.
No, I love that. Thank you. I'd love to bring in Melanie Latson, who's the Policy and Research Manager at the National Black Child Development Institute, in for this too, because I know NBCDI has a fantastic village network that lifts up the work of local communities and the organizations affiliated with you all in them to make these changes at the community level, not only in changing policies, but also building power, building strength for those communities to advocate for themselves. So I'd love to hear sort of how you're seeing this issue around making change at the local level from the perspective of child development and making sure that all our children have healthy early childhoods.
Yeah, thank you so much, Patrick. I love that this question centers local possibility because even in hostile federal moments, I believe real change begins in communities and creates impact in real time. So at NBCDI, our 8 essential outcomes guides our work, grounded in our belief that caring for the whole child is essential in the early years and must be supported by a strong care infrastructure. We hold as truth that Black children deserve to be born at a healthy weight, live and play in safe communities, breathe clean air, drink clean water, enjoy nourishing meals with vegetables, attend schools that affirm and expand them, be seen and treated as children, have books and toys that reflect who they are and who they can be, and grow up with access to a safe and appropriate internet. So we also know that this work can't be done in isolation. It truly takes a village. And if we believe in caring for the whole child, then we must also believe in building the whole village that sustains them. So that belief comes to life through our 26 villages across the country. We trust that community members know what's best for their communities. Our villages are embedded in towns and cities, and they really function as frontline architects of the care infrastructure. I'm sorry, the care infrastructure for our children. For example, our BCDI New York village is hosting a morning of breaking bread and rebuilding community around education and child well-being this Valentine's Day. And this will provide a space for Black and Brown educators, community organizations, local residents to come together and name what children need now and what must be built next. So that to me is community power in action without waiting on the federal level to do anything. We also have in North Carolina going on, our BCDI Greensboro Village runs a free after school program for students in grades K through 5. That's, of course, supports academic success as well as whole child development, providing safe, affirming spaces where learning and care happens together. And those are just a couple of examples of how cities and towns can improve outcomes for children by investing in the care ecosystems families already rely on. Those investments may also look like supporting family-friendly neighbor care providers, that is very important through resources, stipends, things like that. Expanding healthy food access with school-based pantries and community programs, or providing accessible mental health supports for moms and caregivers, especially. When communities take these steps, I believe they stop waiting for federal permission and start building community-owned systems of care, and that improves outcomes for kids right now.
I love that. That's so crucial. And I love the idea of hosting an event like that on Valentine's Day. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, that's great. We need more love in our communities for our children and families for sure. For sure.
definitely.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, at this point, I'd love to talk about how we can actually, make these changes that so many of us have identified on this call. The solutions, like we were talking about, are already there. What's required is the public and the political will to actually implement them. So I'd love to bring in the rest of our panelists for this final section to talk about how do we work across different sectors to make change? Um, all of us have, different hats. We work at very similar problems, just from different angles. We have funders here, advocates, policy experts, researchers. Um, so I'd love to start with you, Anthony. One of the things that you and I talked about in earlier conversations was the importance of not only bringing people together across sectors, across departments, agencies, but one of the key points you raised was you also need accountability when these things come together. When uh, you bring together a table of stakeholders, or a table of people in different departments who certainly are aligned on a common mission, but that's not always enough to actually get the thing done. I'm curious, from if you could share an example or two from your experience of how that logjam can happen, and what everybody watching this should sort of take as a lesson to avoid.
Well, one, thank you for the question. Many years ago, when I worked at the state, I was in the state of Ohio. One of the former governors had a vision to create the Office of Early Childhood Education. And he wanted to bring in all of the departments that had a piece of early childhood, from public health to social services to the Department of Education, developmental disabilities, and the like. And so you had 4 or 5 different leaders, but there was no one that was really put in charge to align the work. And the governor's office was set the expectation, but still there was no one fully in charge. And when you're dealing with government money, there's different rules that are set for each of those different funding streams. And instead of really integrating it, it kind of died out with that particular governor. Fast forward, there's a new governor that set the expectation upon being elected and created the Department of Children and Youth. And all of those different departments came into one umbrella. And thus, the policy, technology, and systems are also on the table to be integrated. And then another example here in Charlotte, I led a team at the county to integrate health and human services into one particular location. And the goal was to have one unified application. And then depends on what the family needs are, it would go in the particular swim lane, and those individuals would get the support they need. There isn't a lot of examples because of these huge systems that are set up to manage these various programs. But if you have a strong leader that is committed to integration, that is committed to placing services where the people that need them the most can gain access to them, it can actually work. This whole thing called braided funding, integrated funding, takes some advocacy sometimes with the state and or federal government to do, because again, the basis of this is people, don't become poor or unneedy between programs. We should not treat them that way. We shouldn't traumatize them just because they need multiple access to multiple programs. We should give them the access they need in order to have a healthy child, and sometimes a healthy birth, and good and better birth outcomes.
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I'd like to turn to you, Zakia. One of the things Laura mentioned earlier is Boston is often looked at as an exemplary city. I think New York, too, in a lot of ways is. And certainly both cities are getting a lot of things right. But I think also for folks in smaller cities and towns, there can be sort of a bit of fatalism around that. Well, New York can do this, but we can't. Or Boston can implement this, but there's no way we could. Um, as someone who's spent a lot of your career redefining what's possible at all in your advocacy and being able to push the envelope of what's possible, how have you seen that cross-sector advocacy rooted in neighborhoods, rooted in the lived experiences of the people can actually reframe that and can actually give communities the kind of resources, the kind of systemic change that for a lot of people who are just dealing with this day in and day out, I think may not even be possible at all.
Yeah. Yeah, the political will thing is real, and the advocacy. There's no political will without advocacy. It just doesn't happen, right? And it's a vital part of it. Part of this that's always missing too is even no matter how small you think you are, how big you think you are, it's like a deep understanding. And I feel like Melanie talked about this of the community understanding how the system works. Why don't you have the thing? What can you do to make the change? Because otherwise you get the fatalistic, because I don't know where to go. I don't know why this thing even exists. It might have a long history. So we need to tell people if it has a long history. We need to tell people if it's just under this particular elected official that this is happening, right? Because when people understand it, and when they talk to their families, it's not like, I don't know, it's not, it doesn't become, oh yeah, of course it's going to be what it's going to be, which we've heard many times in the Black and brown communities, because that's been our lived experience. It becomes, oh, I know why, right? And so, for example, in New York, this, and I keep using childcare because it is on the lips of everybody, on the tips of everybody's tongue around childcare, especially here in New York State, which is we had a mayor who got elected to be mayor, Mayor Mamdani, who made it a priority. And to me, he was an example of what it looks like when leadership really wants something. They listen to the people on the ground and they say, we're going to make this our mission, and no matter what, right? Like it's not a no, it's a how are we going to do it? And so that's part of it's the same thing with us. I think about the longevity around our fight for the campaign for fiscal equity dollars in New York State to fund our public schools. It was a constant, you know, almost 30-year battle to get this fully funded. 30 years, it shouldn't take that long, right? But again, racism plays a major role in that. Why? Because the children who would have received it and the families and communities who would have uplifted It's a struggle every day. So again, that still remains at number one. But what it was is like agitating the community, educating them. That's families, that's students, that's educators, that's anybody who wants to, including elected officials, around what the impact of this change could look like. And the fact that we hadn't done the thing yet. And if we do this thing, it will have all these great implications. It's the same thing with childcare. So now the state is on fire because as AQE, as part of the Empire State Campaign for childcare, for almost a decade now, we have been laying the foundation and the advocacy around why universal childcare is so important. But it took time. It takes time to let folks know that this is not just about free for the sake of free. What does this actually mean? Who does this actually impact? And we were ready for the moment that came in Zoran Mamdani. We were ready because we had educated folks across the state, elected officials including, what this means, what this looks like, the workforce, how important it is. And we have been a dog with the bone on that part too. Like you don't get expansion without the workforce. So all this stuff is like setting the foundation so folks have a clear understanding of who the players, who's the power mapping of who moves this, who doesn't move this, and why don't I have the thing, who would receive it, and it's statewide because what they do, as we talked about silos too, is that in New York State there is an upstate downstate silo that was not created by the community. I challenge it was created by elected officials who it makes it easier for them to say, oh, don't vote for that thing. It only supports New York City. Oh no, New York City, look what they're talking about up there. They talk bad about us. And so that constant bringing folks together to say, this is a we thing. This is a community thing. If we don't get universal childcare, it doesn't just impact New York City, it impacts us all. And I think as AQE, that's a role we've been vitally playing for the last 25 years, is to let folks know we don't get anything passed in the legislature if the whole state doesn't buy into it. And they should be buying into the things that we talk about that's centered in equity and all those things, right? So I think the public education part is vitally important to create the public will, to agitate folks to advocacy and be there for the moment, which we are able to capture right now, specifically around childcare, early childcare, um, with this new administration. But we set foundation, and we're strategic on how we do these things. And sometimes the moment comes and you just don't know. And for us, it was the same thing with Foundation Aid. It was the same thing. We were ready for the moment when it came, and we were able to get that funded. It took almost 30 years, but like we have to plant the seeds, and educate our community so they know.
Yeah, I think that's crucial. Especially for a lot of people who are looking at change at the community level from a far remove, it can feel like a shot out of the dark, right? They'll read a headline, there's a new mayor in New York City, or there's a court ruling that, ensures schools get billions of dollars more. And they don't see the countless, hours spent in long, arduous meetings and the one-on-one conversations on doorsteps that it took for years and years to get to that place. And that's, I think, also one of the barriers of replicating successes elsewhere, is because we only see the outcome often. We're not there. There are never news cameras on those, small parent meetings on a Saturday night, right? Um, and I think part of that is absolutely crucial to power building. Uh, Krista, I'd love for you to talk about the role that foundations and funders should play in making sure that power building happens. Because certainly RWJF, like the Shaw Foundation, we do have a systems change oriented theory of change. Neither of us have the endowments to simply implement the ideal equitable system, but by leveraging community advocacy, grassroots power building. I mean, that's the real ROI if we want to talk about ROI. Spending millions in grants to get billions in public dollars shifted to more equitable results. I'll take that deal any day. Carissa, especially for the funders who are on this call, who are maybe interested in thinking about beyond sort of the programs systems dichotomy that Anthony mentioned earlier, what would be good first steps? What are the things that funders should keep in mind as they may dip their toes into these waters?
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. And I'm gonna throw a wrench in because I'm gonna talk about power building, because power building, organizing of parent and family leaders, community leaders that have children and families at the center is really critical. I think it's critical to build the on-ramps to that village that I mentioned earlier. And there are national organizations like Moms Rising and Red, Wine, and Blue that create relationships and shared purpose towards that better we that philanthropy can invest in. And if you're a parent and family caregiver, you can tap in and get involved if you're feeling disconnected. They have that you can get engaged in both online and off. And there are also local organizations, parent and family organizers, like Kofi in Illinois, Mothering Justice in Michigan, Parent Voices Oakland, Family Forward, AQENY, right? Like there are people in your backyard, and those are the organizations. It's not an either or, it is a both and of national organizations who are deeply accountable to their state and local networks and or that do work in states in right relationship with those family caregivers, as well as the folks who have that local presence. But the other kind of power that philanthropy, I think, leaves on the table a lot is narrative power. And I want to be really clear, I'm not talking about strategic communications that root themselves in voters in a poll about a political opinion for a short-term goal. I'm talking about the discipline of narratives, strategic communications, and other forms of messaging that are aligned in purpose towards that shared value that children and family health and well-being is paramount, and works to push against those deeply held cultural mindsets like individualism. And I brought up the tea towel, not just because, like, one, it's fun, but two, because so oftentimes we cede the language we use in our power building and especially in our advocacy and political work to narratives that were developed and invested in by people who don't have that shared value. And we don't have mechanisms to deploy or shift culture at a mass scale. So what we see and what we encounter on our YouTube or our Instagram or our TikToks or even on our broadcast news is language that's framed and held with that cultural mindset that's working against children and families. And so I would also offer, in addition to building power of organizations that work with grassroots partners on political agendas, we have to work on messaging, storytelling, and narrative agendas that aren't short-term about the policy win, but are rooted in that far-off vision. And if you're interested in that, my colleagues are setting up opportunities to learn more and invest together in what it means to support narrative infrastructure. So hit me up if you are curious about that as a funder, because there's a lot we've done, but there's so much more we could do together.
That's a great point. Narrative is not only in my job title, but it is absolutely very, very important because it is, if we use the language of the folks who are opposed to us, we're really, we're struggling with an arm tied behind our back, right? Especially when it comes to building that public and political will and the stories we tell about ourselves and each other. Laura, I'd love to turn sort of the penultimate question to you. What are the ways that you've seen that communities can learn from each other? The collaboration is not just across sectors, but to the point where, when we were talking with Zakia, it can be hard to find out exactly what are the nuts and bolts involved in making this big system change, how we can replicate it or adapt it to our local context. What are the successes you've seen in terms of cities and towns collaborating across geographic distance to make the positive outcomes, replicate elsewhere?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. So I think something that I love about our work is that we do set the table and bring local leaders together in peer networks. And we keep on hearing, especially during this time, like I think there's a lot of like, we don't have the answers. What's going on? What's happening next? But just being able to like bring one another together and hear that they're not alone and that they're facing similar challenges and what they're prioritizing during this time and what's working, I think has been really helpful. And so that's definitely something that NLC continues to prioritize and will moving forward as well. The only other thing, and Zakia, based off your point, I think, and Patrick, how you framed the question that like not all cities are Bostons and New Yorks and don't have necessarily the mayoral buy-in and the resources that those cities might have. So just what we've heard from cities is like, that's great that you gave us an example, but like, what are the concrete steps that we can take in our city to kind of replicate or create an early childhood system and prioritize? Maybe we live in a red state. Maybe we don't have, again, the resources. Maybe we're a small rural community. And so definitely, Patrick, I know you mentioned that we're able to share out resources after the fact, but we've created an early childhood municipal roadmap to early childhood success that really like lays out concrete steps and like the importance of community engagement and what that looks like in cities and what steps you can take in cities, no matter your no matter your location, city demographics, region, et cetera. And so I think that is continuing to lift up city examples and specific steps has been really beneficial, I think, that from what we hear from cities.
Amazing. That's great. And I'd love to pass. I know we're just about out of time, but I want to bring you and Melanie to talk about uh, how the advocacy that your partners on the ground are doing can cross over those issue silos. You know, the eight essential outcomes for Black children that NBCDI identifies really crosses a lot of sectors. It's everything from healthy birth weight to access to quality food, clean air and water. There's not one department in a city or a county that covers all of that. So I'm curious if you know from your experience and what folks are saying how the folks in your network are managing cutting across those issue silos, those different sectors to improve outcomes and get those eight essential outcomes better.
Thank you for the question. I think what comes to mind for me first is our Afrofuturist systems design process, because that's a tool we use across communities. We know that many cities are facing the same challenges. And the common thread is not a lack of ideals, but a lack of shared power. So this process really helps communities name the harmful mental models shaping our systems, shift them into affirming Afrofuturist mental models, and then co-design community-powered interventions together. So we must remember that systems are built on narratives, just as Krista mentioned, the importance of narratives, and communities have to be trusted to redesign those narratives. They don't just respond to harm, they really build those features if we trust the communities to do so. So our village network is our proximity experts. They're the parents, the educators, they're caregivers, and they're able to not only work from a place of theory, but also lived experience. And our model allows them to collaborate across space, that cross-pollination across sectors with education leaders, health practitioners, childcare advocates, and partnering with housing, food access organizers, all those different components so that they can work on those essential outcomes, one outcome at a time, but all simultaneously together. So I would say definitely making sure when we highlight our village network, it's pretty much a model for how that collaboration can happen, where they don't have to stay within the silos. They can work together to rewrite the future our children really deserve to inherit.
I love that because that is what it's all about. It's, the world that all our children deserve to inherit. So that's a fantastic point to end on. Thank you so much to our panelists for this discussion today. I know we could talk about this for hours, but we've all got to get back to the work that we were talking about, right? So thank you all who have attended for attending today. We'll be sending out a recap and a recording of this along with resources from all of these organizations and next steps for you all to get involved in. And until then, thanks again so much, and we'll all see you soon.